The bank lobby was too bright for how empty I felt, the kind of fluorescent light that makes everything look exposed. My hands were numb from the cold, my coat still smelling like winter air, and my kids stood so close I could feel their breathing against my sides. Christmas Eve, almost closing time, and I had $12 left in my wallet and nowhere to take them when the doors locked. If you've ever felt like your life collapsed in a single night, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because moments like this are more common than we admit. The marble floor reflected our shadows like we didn't quite belong there. A clock ticked too loudly. Somewhere outside, people were laughing, heading home to warmth I couldn't offer. Just hours earlier, we had a house, a tree, a future that felt stable. Now I was standing still, pretending not to fall apart, wondering how trust could disappear so completely. I didn't know yet that this wasn't the end, just the moment everything started to unravel. I was standing in a bank lobby on Christmas Eve, the kind of quiet that feels louder than shouting, pressing in on my ears. The floor was cold through my shoes, my hands shaking as I held my kids close, trying to look like I knew what I was doing. My name is Sarah Miller, and that night it was just me, my 9-year-old daughter, and my 6-year-old son. With nowhere to sleep and $12 left to our name, a few hours earlier, we had a house, we had a tree, wrapped gifts, and a plan for morning pancakes. By early evening, all of it was gone. Taken so quickly, I still felt like I was moving underwater. I remember standing there thinking this kind of thing only happens to other people, not to someone who was folding laundry that morning. My daughter was squeezing my hand so hard it hurt, pretending she wasn't scared. My son pressed his face into my coat, whispering that he was cold. I kept telling myself to stay calm, to be steady, even as my chest felt hollow. I had no idea how we ended up there, only a heavy sense that whatever broke our lives apart hadn't happened in a single night, but quietly, over time before then. I keep replaying how easily my life narrowed without me noticing. Before marriage and kids and schedules, I was someone with plans. In my early 20s, I believed effort would turn into independence. I imagined work that mattered, a voice that counted, a future shaped by my own hands. When I met my husband, it felt like momentum, not sacrifice. He had certainty, and I trusted it. When he suggested I pause school, it sounded temporary, practical, even loving. I told myself there would be time later. When I shifted my focus to our home, it felt like building something together. I was proud to support, proud to be needed. The changes were small. I stopped talking about my goals because they felt less urgent. I turned down opportunities because stability seemed wiser. Each choice made sense on its own. None of them felt like giving up. They felt like growing up, like compromise, like love. Over time, my days filled with logistics instead of dreams. I kept calendars, remembered appointments, smoothed over problems before they became problems. I told myself this was contribution, even if no one called it that. I learned to measure my worth by how smoothly things ran. What I didn't see was how quietly my world shrank. Depending on someone else became normal. Asking instead of deciding became routine. I wasn't forced into the background. I stepped there willingly. Believing partnership meant standing slightly behind, looking back. I realized how vulnerable that made me. I didn't lose myself all at once. I misplaced myself in pieces, trusting they would still be there when I reached for them again. At the time, I thought this was adulthood. I thought love meant adjustment. I didn't notice how rarely my needs entered the room, or how easy it became for my presence to fade, quietly, until being unseen felt ordinary, and I stopped questioning it entirely by then. I didn't notice the shift at first because nothing sounded harsh. Money was handled for me, presented as efficiency, as relief. I told myself it was easier this way, that I was lucky not to worry about bills or decisions. Still, each time I needed something, I felt a pause inside me, a small calculation about whether it was worth asking. Asking became routine. Groceries, gas, school supplies. I explained instead of deciding. I waited instead of acting. Every request made me feel slightly smaller, like I was interrupting something more important. No one said I couldn't. But the discomfort did the work on its own. I learned how to stay quiet. If something bothered me, I softened it. If I disagreed, I reconsidered. I told myself peace mattered more than being right. Over time, silence stopped feeling temporary. It felt expected. I adapted without realizing I was disappearing. I became background noise in my own life, useful, dependable, unnoticed. I filled gaps, solved problems, kept things running. When everything worked, no one noticed. When something didn't, it was my responsibility. That imbalance felt normal because it grew slowly. My mother noticed before I did. She asked gentle questions, the kind that linger after the moment passes. I brushed them off, convinced I was fine, that this was just how marriage worked. Looking back, I see how invisible I had become, even to myself. What started as private imbalance was hardening into something official, something that would soon be measured, documented, and judged by people who never knew what it took to hold everything together. I was about to learn how unforgiving systems can be when they only see paperwork, timelines, and income, and how quickly a life of quiet labor can be dismissed without context or compassion entirely there. When the divorce moved from our home into a courtroom, I expected clarity. What I found instead was distance. My life was laid out in neat columns, stripped of context, translated into numbers that felt unfamiliar and cold. Years of care, planning, and emotional labor were reduced to footnotes that didn't seem to matter. I sat there listening as my marriage was described like a failed transaction. I wasn't asked who I was or what I had carried. I was categorized, non-working, dependent, replaceable. Each label landed quietly but cut deep. I kept thinking about the nights I stayed up sick with worry, the days I stretched time and energy to keep our family stable, and how none of it had a line item. The ruling came with an efficiency that felt brutal, a settlement, a timeline, an expectation that I would adjust. I nodded because that was what I had learned to do. Inside, something collapsed. I remember feeling embarrassed for even hoping the system might see me. When it was over, I walked out holding papers that decided my future without ever knowing me. I told myself this was the worst part, that at least now I knew where I stood. There was a strange calm in that belief, a fragile sense that the uncertainty had ended. I didn't know then how wrong that was. I thought the damage had been done in that room. I had no idea how personal it was about to become, or how quickly the small amount of stability I clung to would be taken from me entirely, without warning or mercy. I still believed the rules would protect me. Somehow. Eventually. I remember how quiet the house felt that afternoon, the kind of quiet that comes before something breaks. The kids were at the table, crumbs on their sleeves, talking about Christmas morning like it was guaranteed. I was cleaning up when I heard engines outside, heavy and unfamiliar, too deliberate to ignore. By the time I looked out the window, I already knew. A truck, another car behind it. My chest tightened as the truth settled in before my mind could catch up. This wasn't a visit. This was an ending. Everything moved fast after that, but my body felt slow. The cold rushed in as doors opened. The house no longer felt like ours. It felt temporary, like we were already guests in a place that had been taken back. I kept thinking about the tree in the corner, the presents underneath it, how carefully we had wrapped hope into paper. My daughter stood frozen, trying to understand why safety was suddenly negotiable. My son clung to me, asking questions I couldn't answer without breaking. I focused on packing clothes, hands shaking, choosing what could be carried and what had to be abandoned. Each item left behind felt like proof that we didn't matter. The air outside bit hard. Night came early. Bags were heavier than they should have been. As we stepped away, I didn't look back at the house. I looked at my kids. Something shifted then. Fear stopped being useful. Panic drained out and left something colder, steadier. We didn't have a plan. We didn't have a place. What we had was motion, survival. I held their hands and started walking, not knowing where we were going yet. only knowing that standing still wasn't an option anymore, and that whatever came next would have to be faced head-on. Every step felt unreal, but the sound of my children breathing beside me kept me present. I told myself this moment would not be the end, even if it felt like the ground had disappeared beneath us, and that somehow, tonight, we would endure it together, still. We walked until the lights of the bank came into view, bright and impersonal against the dark street. It was late, close to closing, and everything inside looked too clean for how we felt. The kids stayed close, coats zipped tight, eyes following every movement like the floor might disappear. I stood at the counter knowing I had nothing left to offer. My wallet held $12 and a few receipts that didn't matter anymore. I remember thinking how strange it was that survival could shrink to something so small. I searched my bag anyway, more out of habit than hope, fingers brushing fabric and lint until they touched plastic. The card looked old, worn smooth at the edges. I hadn't thought about it in years. My mother gave it to me when she was sick, pressing it into my hand like an afterthought and telling me to keep it safe. I never asked why. I never needed it before. Holding it there, I hesitated. Using it felt like admitting failure, like crossing a line I wasn't supposed to cross. I told myself it probably held nothing. Still, I handed it over, heart pounding harder than it should have. The reaction was immediate and wrong in a way I couldn't explain. The banker didn't dismiss me or hurry me along. His expression changed, sharpened, and then softened. He looked at the screen, then at me, like something had finally been recognized. The banker didn't speak right away. He looked at the screen again, then at the card, then at me, as if he needed to be certain I was real. I felt my stomach drop, fear rushing back in, until he gently asked me to follow him somewhere private. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about a balance or a mistake. Inside a small office, away from the lights and noise, the truth came out slowly. The card wasn't empty. It was connected to something my mother had put in place years ago, something deliberate and carefully protected, a trust, not large in a flashy way, but solid, intentional, designed for one specific moment, this moment. I struggled to understand it at first. My mother never talked about money. She never warned me. She never hinted that she was planning anything. And yet, she had thought far ahead, further than I ever did. She had prepared for the possibility that my life might collapse quietly, the way it did. The realization hit me in waves. Shock, then grief, then something steadier. She had seen what I couldn't. She had trusted that if everything else was taken, I would still find my way to that card, that I would finally have nothing left to lose. For the first time that night, my breathing slowed. The room felt warmer. My kids were given something to drink and sat close, unaware that the ground beneath us was stabilizing again. I wasn't saved by luck. I was held by someone who loved me enough to plan for my worst day. Before I left that office, the banker placed an envelope in front of me. My name was written on it in my mother's handwriting. Seeing it made my hands shake. I knew then that what she left me wasn't just protection, it was understanding, and I wasn't ready yet. But I was about to read her words. I waited until the kids were settled before opening the envelope. The paper felt thinner than I expected. My mother's handwriting uneven, familiar, alive in a way that caught me off guard. As I read, I felt her presence steady me, not dramatic, just clear. Her words didn't accuse or rage. They named what I had lived. She saw how I gave, how I bent, how I chose peace over conflict, because I believed love required it. She didn't call that weakness. She called it capacity. Reading that loosened something tight in my chest. She reminded me that sacrifice doesn't erase worth, that years spent caring, organizing, holding people together are not empty years. They are proof of endurance. I realized how long I had been carrying shame that was never mine, mistaking quiet for smallness. The letter didn't dwell on pain. It offered direction, not revenge, not drama, just clarity. She had prepared a path forward and trusted me to walk it when I was ready. She believed I would recognize truth once fear stopped drowning it out. I folded the paper and rested it against my heart. Grief rose, but it was braided with strength. I wasn't being rescued. I was being reminded of who I had been before I disappeared, of who I still was. When I stood up, something inside me felt aligned for the first time in years. The chaos outside the room hadn't vanished, but my footing had returned. I knew the next steps wouldn't be easy, but they were mine to take, and for the first time since everything fell apart, I felt prepared to move, forward, steady, awake, and finally, unafraid again. I didn't rush. That surprised me most. After reading my mother's letter, I moved slowly, deliberately, like someone who finally understood the ground beneath her feet. Fear had always pushed me to react. Clarity let me choose. The next morning, I followed the path she had prepared. Names, numbers, steps laid out with quiet precision. Reaching out for help no longer felt like begging. It felt like claiming something that was already mine, for the first time. I wasn't explaining myself. I was informing people. Each action was small on its own. A meeting scheduled, documents reviewed, questions asked without apology. But together, they shifted the air around me. I could feel it in my body. The absence of that constant tightness in my chest. I slept that night. Really slept. What changed wasn't the situation yet. It was me. I stopped bracing for impact. I stopped assuming I would be dismissed. I listened, took notes, and made decisions from a place that felt steady instead of desperate. There were signs, subtle but unmistakable, that things were already moving. Calls returned faster than before. Voices on the other end of the line sounded careful, attentive. The imbalance I had lived under for years was no longer invisible. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm, prepared. Whatever came next would happen in the open, with records and witnesses and accountability. The silence that once worked against me was gone. Something formal was coming, something public, and this time, I was ready. Walking back into the courtroom felt different this time. The room was the same, the benches, the seal on the wall, the quiet tension in the air, but I wasn't. I sat down without shrinking. My hands rested calmly in my lap. I didn't rehearse what I would say because I wasn't there to plead anymore. As the proceedings moved forward, the story I had lived was finally described with accuracy. Not emotion, not sympathy, just facts laid out clearly and carefully. What had once been dismissed was now examined. What had been hidden was now visible. I listened without flinching. Aware of how steady my breathing was, I didn't look at my ex-husband. I didn't need to. His presence felt distant, almost irrelevant, like something already moving into the past. The focus wasn't on him unraveling, it was on the record being corrected. When the judgment came, it wasn't dramatic, it was firm. The imbalance that shaped my life for years was formally acknowledged and undone. I felt something loosen inside me. Not relief exactly, but alignment. The truth had weight here. It mattered. For the first time in a long while, I felt seen without having to explain myself. My choices, my labor, my silence were understood in context. That recognition settled quietly, deeply. As the session ended, there was no urge to celebrate, just a sense of completion, a chapter closing with intention instead of loss. I walked out knowing the fight was over, not because I won, but because it had finally been named for what it was. What came next wouldn't be about proving anything. It would be about living, honestly, without fear, and building something steady from the ground up, on my own terms. Life didn't transform overnight after the courtroom. What changed first was the quiet. We moved into a small house that felt safe, not impressive, but ours. The doors locked solidly. The heat worked. I slept with my phone face down for the first time in years. Routines returned slowly. Breakfast at the same table. Homework spread across the floor. My daughter started laughing again. Real laughter that surprised her. My son asked fewer questions at night. His door still open, but his breathing calmer. I learned to measure progress in ordinary moments. I found myself again in pieces. I organized the days, but this time for us. I made choices without asking permission. I started drawing at the kitchen counter after the kids went to bed. not to prove anything, just because it felt familiar. Creating didn't fix everything, but it reminded me who I was before fear narrowed my world. There were still hard days. Healing wasn't a straight line. But the panic that once lived in my chest softened into caution. Then trust. Peace didn't arrive loudly. It settled in like a habit. Some evenings, I would sit in the quiet and realize I wasn't bracing for impact anymore. Nothing was about winning. It was about steadiness, about building a life that felt honest. Even on its simplest days, that steadiness gave me space to reflect on what this journey meant and why telling it matters. That understanding now guides me forward with gratitude, humility, and care daily. I want to end this by speaking to you directly, especially if any part of this felt familiar. For a long time, I believed strength looked loud and certainty looked sharp. I thought surviving meant enduring quietly and asking for less. What I learned is that quiet does not mean weak, and starting over does not mean late. If you feel invisible in your own life, I see you now. If you are carrying responsibilities that never get counted, that weight matters. The years you spent holding things together were not wasted. They were shaping you for a moment when you would finally stand in your own name. Rebuilding didn't give me a perfect life. It gave me an honest one, safety, choice, the ability to breathe without bracing. That is success. Even when it looks small from the outside, I'm grateful you stayed with me through this story. Being heard changed something in me. And I hope it reminds you that your voice has value too. If you are in the middle of your own beginning, know that you are not behind. You are becoming. If this story touched you, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? And what did starting over look like in your life? Thank you for listening and sharing this space.